I approached this with some trepidation because Denis Noble was actually my doctoral examiner.
Richard, we're in the chair again.
I hope I pass today.
We've actually got biology backwards. We think genes created us, body and mind. That's to quote Richard Dawkins, the selfish gene. But they don't. It's the other way round. Gene-centric biology is actually nonsense, and it's now being proven to be nonsense.
After that meeting, the tone in evolutionary biology shifted a lot, and the usual bullies just went silent.
I debated all of this with Richard Dawkins, and he had no answers. Darwin would not have agreed with the neo-Darwinism. We've got the evolution story completely wrong.
And it has a very stifling effect on research.
The gene-centric genome sequencing project has been a tragic and catastrophic failure.
We've been running on the wrong definition of cancer for the last 50 years, and we are running on the wrong definition of evolution.
Purposive biological investigation is actually much more predictive than the genome.
There are many branches of medicine that cannot and will not be successful until you assume an intrinsically purposeful nature of body cells, tissues, and immune system.
Your idea is revolutionary.
I had an audience of 12,000. This is a country that has totally switched from gene-centrism to the opposite view. Life has purpose. That is quite possible. The United Kingdom quite soon will experience the same kind of transition that's already occurred in Korea.
And it's a huge paradigm shift in the way that you practice medicine.
If Denis is right, then I've been wrong for 50 years, and so have most of the people now working in the field.
Well, what a privilege to be joined today by Perry Marshall and Denis Noble, both of whom have interests and expertise in the area of biology, information systems, and really where we sit at the moment when it comes to evolution, genetics, and the way in which we have developed the diversity of life that we see on Earth. Really looking forward to this conversation. Perry, let's start with you. We go back some way. Just remind us briefly how you got interested in this whole area.
I went to China to see my brother, who was a missionary 20 years ago, and he said, I don't believe this stuff anymore. I'm moving back home in a month or two, and I don't consider myself a Christian. And it got us into an argument. And I said, Brian, look at the hand at the end of your arm. This is a nice piece of engineering. I'm an engineer. I should know. And he pushed right back with a very standard mutation, natural selection kind of an argument. And I'd never really had that argument before. And I thought, well, I've never learned a single thing in my entire engineering career that would support what he just said. That doesn't make any sense. But I also thought, there's a lot of things in science that are very counterintuitive. And rather than arguing with him, I'm going to just stop and I'm going to go home and I'm going to figure this out, because he was pushing my buttons really hard too. We'd already been having this conversation for a while. And so I said, I'm going to go home. I'm going to hit the books. I'm going to read the scientific papers, whatever I got to do. And I'm going to figure out, does it really make sense that just billiard balls banging around in the universe and natural selection would explain? You're going to have to explain this to an engineer who can read a science paper. And so I went down that rabbit hole and I discovered an incredible array of things that I couldn't have even imagined, including Denis Noble and people that have worked with him over the years, Lynn Margulis, who worked with Denis for a long time. And I formed a completely different picture of biology than I ever had growing up as a creationist, and certainly very different than the selfish gene kind of thing that was being preached everywhere in the world at the time. And it's turned into a second career. So here we are today.
Here we are indeed. Denis, perhaps just give a very potted history of your background as a scientist, your research interests, and what's drawn you into partnering with Perry in researching these issues?
Well, I started as a scientist interested in a very practical question. The heart rhythm, the beating of the heart, was in 1960, when I was a research student at University College London, one of the biggest open questions still in physiology. How does a set of molecules generate that nice once per second, roughly, rhythm? And I was allocated to do work with a physiologist called Otto Hutter, who was working on the heart. And quite rapidly in the course of that work, we found two membrane proteins, they're called channels, that carry potassium. Those are ions, charged atoms. And I wondered then, could it be that the characterization of those proteins would enable me to understand the generation of the rhythm, which took me into some very deep mathematical modeling work. Now, my supervisor was completely outside the area of mathematics in biology, so he said to me, "Denis, you're on your own." I pleaded with the people who used a very big machine, a computer, a valve computer in those days, to let me have time on the machine, because I worked out with a hand calculator it would take years to do the relevant calculations. I succeeded, and 6 months later I had a paper in Nature, sole author paper, before I even got my thesis. And that started a process which 30 years later, now fast forwarding to about 1990, we realized was only half the story. Yes, I had succeeded in working out what generated the heart rhythm, but I'd only found maybe a quarter of the total story, because we found that any one of those proteins could be knocked out and the rhythm would still continue. That meant, and that's what we discovered, that there are other processes that come in, and this introduced me to a very general property of biological systems. They are fail-safe. That, incidentally, explains why the gene-centric genome sequencing project has been such a tragic and catastrophic failure for us. That's been announced very recently from a study at University College London, where I was studying 60-odd years ago, showing that if you subject the predictions from the genetics, the genome sequencing, to possible disease, cardiovascular disease, cancer, the two big ones, nervous diseases, yet another great big area of diseases, the answer is zilch. Subject that information to the same criteria as for clinical trial of a new drug, and you get a failure of prediction. Now, I realized when I retired in 2004, so just 20 years ago, that this was big. This is the reason why gene-centric biology is actually nonsense, and it's now been proven to be nonsense. You don't have genes for this, genes for that, except in a very few rare genetic diseases affecting about 5% of the population. So I thought it's time to say, hey, wait a minute, we've actually got biology backwards. We think genes created us, body and mind. That's to quote Richard Dawkins, the selfish gene. But they don't. It's the other way round. We are the controllers of what our proteins and the genes that enable them to be made do. It's very simple. It's like asking the question, is the music the notes on the sheet of paper that Schubert wrote his composition on? No, it isn't, until somebody plays it. And that's the key. The active playing is us as organisms, which means, even more relevant to your program, that purpose in biology is back, because what gives purpose in biology, it's us. It's us as creative individuals. Now, that's a very strange story, going all the way from being a very reductionist, if you like, scientist working out heart rhythm, to then coming out 40 years later to say, wait a minute, this is big. And it means that in biology, we've got the evolution story and the gene-centric story completely wrong. There's a potted history of what happened to me.
It's an excellent potted history. Thank you very much. And I appreciated the analogy you used there at the end for those of us who aren't scientists to get our heads around it. But what would be helpful perhaps is for you to, again, briefly, if you will, Perry, just sketch out what the prevailing narrative has been around this in science. I know that sort of at a popular level, at least, that Richard Dawkins explanation has been widely accepted, touted, disseminated. Could you describe it and then just, again, explain just what you've been seeing in recent years that has been overturning that predominant neo-Darwinian narrative?
Well, I heard Richard Dawkins on an NPR station once a very long time ago, and a caller called in and asked, Mr. Dawkins, where did life come from? And he very glibly replied, it was a happy chemical accident. And then they just went on to the next person as though that was the answer and it was settled. And I was aghast that any self-respecting scientist would say such an anti-scientific answer. And then I go read his books, and it says that we are lumbering robots carrying our genes, and that we exist for the purpose of our genes replicating. And this is a very popular narrative in the popular culture, but very few scientists who are doing highly productive work in the present actually believe that. And so I'll just give you one example. Michael Levin took lung cells out of a cadaver who had just died, so the cells are still alive, put them in a petri dish so that they had nutrients, and they spent about 3 days reforming themselves into you could only describe as a different organism. They turned inside out, and the cilia that used to push mucus up out of the lung turned into propellers, and they started swimming around. And when they put a plate coated with nerve tissue, they put scratched nerves, they put damaged nerves in the petri dish. The former lung cells went and attached themselves to those nerve cells and started repairing the nerve damage. Now, they have the same genomes as lung cells or as a human, but they are functioning as an autonomous organism that is no longer a lung and operating cooperatively. It's likely that they are picking up signals from the nerve cells. We don't know this for sure. It's a good guess they are picking up signals, maybe even SOS signals, and helping them along. And experiments like this show that the genome is just a servant of what the larger organism is doing, and that biology is first and foremost cooperative and not competitive. There's an entire narrative that the world runs on natural selection and survival of the fittest, and it's so pervasive that it is completely overwhelmed the way even scientists work with each other and treat each other. Science is a very cutthroat profession, and I think it's partly because of this narrative that we've had that very poorly reflects the way organisms really work. If you watch Michael Levin's TED Talk, which is 20 minutes long, I don't know how you could finish watching that and still hold the belief that organisms are fundamentally purposeless and that they're just shaped by natural selection. And so I discovered an entire thread of literature going back 70 or 80 years showing a completely different set of conclusions than what was in the popular narrative. Barbara McClintock won the Nobel Prize. Len Margulis was an incredibly respected researcher who brought symbiogenesis, which is the science of cooperation, into popular view. And so what I found when I went deep was completely different than the typical book that you got at the bookstore at Barnes & Noble.
Fascinating. I mean, this is all part of a larger movement that's sometimes been called the third way in biology. Denis, why has this movement been faced such opposition from other scientists in the academy?
Well, I think you have to ask the question, where is the money? It's very simple. Take the National Institute of Mental Health. It's spent $8 billion over the last 20 years on the theory that they would be able to find the genes for schizophrenia, the genes for depression. All of these are phenomena that run in families. So to give them credit, there was, as it were, a basis for thinking that it might be that these are genetic diseases, and therefore we might be able to cure them through discovering which were the genes, go in and repair them, and Bob's your uncle, you've cured the disease. Nothing like that has happened after 30 years of genome sequencing. What we now know is there's no gene for schizophrenia. The sad fact is that we will never predict who is going to suffer that disease from the genetics. So I think part of the problem is that we've got like a big battleship cruising along nicely with its energy being supplied. The energy is the money, of course. It's going to take an almighty effort to turn that around now and say, no, wait a minute, purposive biological investigation is actually much more predictive than the genome. I've shown that. An article that appeared just last year in one of the oldest biological journals in the world, the Journal of the Linnaean Society, named after Linnaeus, the great classifier of species. And what we showed in that article was one example after another where attributing purposiveness to the organism enables you to predict, even at the molecular level, what is happening. Now, that gets technical. I don't think you want a technical account in this particular broadcast. But example after example showed that it was much more predictive of what you need to look for at the lower level of the molecular biology of the organisms concerned than anything to do with genes could be. It really is the case, therefore, one example after another, we've got the whole process backwards. We need now to turn that battleship round. It'll take an enormous amount of effort because there are whole armies of people dedicated to the gene-centric view and doing science on that basis. They can't suddenly all become physiologists and look at function or look at purpose in biology. It's as bad as that. It's as though an army has been sent into a war that's fought for the wrong reason. And you then work out what you're going to do. You've got 1 million people employed with the feeding of them and all the provisions that need to be provided for. And you've got to retrain them as what? Tailors to go back into being, as it were, in civil society. I mean, actually, it's not a bad analogy because after wars, that's what you actually have to do. My father was a tailor. He was a soldier in the First World War too. And so it's a bit like that. We're going to have to find a way of turning this battleship round. And it's going to take an enormous amount of effort to do so. And there is very strong resistance. But I'll tell you another thing. the people who are still broadcasting the idea that genes are going to be the explanation for why we are the living, purposeful organisms we are, they have gone very silent over the last few years. I do not think they have an answer. I debated all of this with Richard Dawkins in a broadcast which has gone viral in various parts of the world, and he had no answers to all the examples I gave. Again, I don't want to go into the technology, but one example after another that I gave to him, he diverted off to use his usual mantra about genes are causes of what we are, rather than address the detailed examples I gave. Everybody can look that up. Everybody can find all the literature that I cited too. It's all there on a website.
Yes, and it's fair to say that possibly Richard Dawkins' most significant work was published in the 1970s, and really actually not much, from what I'm hearing from you, Denis, he hasn't really kept abreast of the way in which this has completely changed in the last few decades. Perry, as Denis says, it's like turning a great big battleship, but there have been a few significant milestones along the way. In 2016, Denis helped to organise this meeting of the Royal Society looking at these issues. Just describe that. You were present for that. What was most significant about this particular meeting being held at the Royal Society?
I went to that meeting, and before the meeting even started, you could tell that there was a very high level of energy in the atmosphere. There was a very high expectation that something really important is going to happen. And as soon as it started, I started hearing things that you would never hear on a large mainstream science stage. A lot of criticism of the old neo-Darwinian paradigm and the selfish gene viewpoint, and the need for a viewpoint that cells are purposeful, tissues are purposeful, life is purposeful, that organisms engineer their own evolution. And there were only two old school neo-Darwinists there, and they gave presentations, and they would sometimes come up in panel discussions and in questions. And I had never seen that group of people backpedaling, mumbling excuses, and trying to save face the way that they were. I had always seen them being the bullies, having the upper hand, and neither the audience nor the other speakers were having it. It was just a complete 180 from the usual stuff. And the people there, they were not, bizarre fringe people. They were some of the most respected scientists in the world. But from a evolutionary biology point of view, most of these people had been sidelined and not listened to. And after that meeting, the tone in evolutionary biology shifted a lot, and the usual bullies just went silent. People could hardly get folks like Jerry Coyne or Daniel Dennett or Richard Dawkins to even comment on it. And Denis can tell more, but my understanding is that one of the reasons Dawkins debated Denis was because there was peer pressure inside of Oxford, like, Richard, if you are a real scientist and you really care to defend your views, you really ought to take on your opposition. And so the tone of evolutionary biology changed a great deal after that meeting. And it became much easier to have conversations about purpose, teleology, all those kind of words that technical people use to describe such things. And I think so now we're 7 or 8 years later, we're in a whole different ball game than we were before.
Hi, Justin here. Hope you're enjoying the conversation. Just to say, if you'd like a free chapter of my book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, I'll send it to you when you join my newsletter. Just visit justinbrierley.com. The link is with the info below. Now, back to the conversation. I'd love to talk about this whole idea of purpose, agency, teleology in biology. Just before we get to it, Denis, just briefly describe for me this recent tour in Korea that you did, South Korea, because that sounds like, again, an example of the way in which this whole area has changed completely in terms of people's reception of these ideas.
Yes, it illustrated it in tons of people listening in. I thought this was going to be a fairly modest conversation with maybe 40 or 50 people. And the theme was human values in the 21st century. This was a group largely of Confucian scholars, but with great influence in the media because some of these were broadcasters themselves. And they were organizing a meeting asking the question, given what has happened in biology now, can one of the most important leaders of this switch in position explain to us the significance of that for human values in the 21st century? I had an audience of 12,000. 4,000 were in the convention center itself. Wow. I didn't even know it was going to be in a huge convention center. But I was shepherded up into this huge convention center, caught a glimpse of the amphitheater where the main presentation would have to occur, and realized there were thousands there. That was the first point at which I realized I'd have to up my game. Well, I have the skill to do that, fortunately. I gave one of the best talks I can ever remember. Now, what I think did that was that the same organization, the Confucianist scholars, but let me also emphasize they're broadcasters. They're television friendly. They know how to handle all of this. They put the debate with Richard Dawkins onto primetime television, subtitled in Korean. The subsequent YouTube version of that has now been seen by about 0.7 million people. This is a country that has gone totally switched from gene-centrism to the opposite view. Life has purpose. It's extraordinary. But I tell you, I can see the signs of that happening here in the UK too. They're still small signs at the moment, but I think the writing is on the wall, if I can put it that way.
And this is the fascinating thing, is that it's the rebirth, if you like, of the idea of purpose, agency in biology, in life. This has been very unfashionable in, really, arguably since Darwin. And it was really sort of has been at the core assumption, really, of biologists and evolutionists for the last century or so. Perhaps starting with you, Perry, you could describe sort of what's switched and why it's now acceptable to talk in these terms about agency, purpose, and, that very loaded term, design even, possibly, when it comes to the way organisms adapt and evolve and so on.
In biology for the last 50 to 100 years, it's been very much frowned upon to speak of living things as being intrinsically purposeful or having desires or having, any level of design. It's been taboo, and it fits very nice. A purposeless narrative fits very nicely with a standard 20th century atheist narrative that says life is a happy chemical accident. Some RNA somehow turned into a cell, and then all that had to do is natural selection and evolution, Darwinian evolution takes over, and here we are. And there's really nothing else to explain. Well, that doesn't work very well when you try to really explain, why a lung cell reformulates itself and goes and wants to repair a nerve cell, that narrative doesn't explain that at all. When you get down to how evolution really works, it doesn't explain any of that either. And so it has a very stifling effect on research. And even though some people who embrace a nihilistic story might like that story, most people find it to be very empty, meaningless, nihilistic. Denis can speak for himself. I think this is one of the things that really irks him about this narrative, is it dehumanizes us. And it fails to explain why we shouldn't just exploit the planet and treat every single thing like a resource that should be maximized for our own good. It's a very impoverished narrative. And, I think there are reasons why all religious narratives tell you what kind of person you should choose to be. All of the religious traditions treat people as though we legitimately have choices to make, and the choice is not just some kind of an illusion. And I feel like biology is finally just catching up to this. It's a little late, but better late than never.
Fantastic. But Denis, please continue. How are you seeing this play out in at present?
Well, first of all, I want to say Darwin would not have agreed with the neo-Darwinists. That's a surprising remark. I've studied Darwin's writings very carefully. And in particular, in the last 10 years or so of his life, he collaborated with physiologists to try to work out what gives organisms their purposiveness. Darwin actually thought that when the peahen was selecting the peacock with his brilliant feathers, that peahen was deliberately choosing that peacock. He called this sexual selection, but you can generalize it to social selection if you wish, because it is the process by which all of us influence subsequent generations. There's another way in which, incidentally, purposiveness, in this case, purposiveness in terms of choosing who you mate with, who your wife is going to be, who your husband is going to be, is inevitably part of what directs our development during our own lifetimes, but also inevitably who we choose, and therefore how our species evolves. So there's the first point I'd like to make in this context. Darwin himself would not have agreed with the modern neo-Darwinists, and I don't think they should use his name, by the way. That's the first point. The second point, though, as I have already emphasized, attributing purpose is actually very explanatory, scientifically explanatory. You see, I'm coming to these issues not from any particular religious position. I'm a simple scientist getting a bit upset that my subject is being misrepresented and that we need to correct what has gone wrong. Okay, if you are brought up in the gene-centric reductionist viewpoint, will have great difficulty with the concept of purpose. I have no difficulty with it now. I had difficulty with it 60 years ago because I came from a reductionist viewpoint. As a student, that's what I was taught. Not surprisingly, I thought this is science. Except that I did wonder as a school student, do the mice that my cat chases, don't they have a wish to escape? And doesn't the cat want to catch them? Isn't it its purpose in life to try to make sure that it feeds on what it finds? I mean, even then, therefore, as a teenager, I remember being a bit surprised that my biology textbook, I've still got it, the textbook I had 70 years ago, I still have it, and it says quite bluntly, Lamarck was wrong because he attributed purpose to organisms. So did Darwin, as I've just said. So my position here is that I come to this, as I say, as a straightforward scientist, interested in the question, what does the science tell us? And I think it tells us that we, and many other organisms, incidentally, are creative organisms. We choose to develop what we choose to develop. If we find ourselves in a strange environment away from those lungs where we came from, they will do what Perry is describing in the work of Michael Levin. They will go off and try and feed in a different way. You just have to say, look, this is a phenomenon that science should be seeking to explain. It doesn't explain it to say it doesn't exist. Well, there's my position. As I said, I'm not coming from this or to this from any particular religious position, but that, of course, has also made it rather difficult for the neo-Darwinists to dismiss somebody like me as just a newfound creationist or a newfound intelligent designer. I don't have to say you can't categorize me as any of that. I come to it as a straightforward scientist interested in the question, what is it in organisms that is important to investigate? And their intentionality is important. Simple as that.
And Perry, at that level, the reductionist, materialist sort of worldview that has essentially informed this area for so long, I think that's partly been so strongly advocated for because of this fear on the part of some scientists that this is a Trojan horse, to suggest any kind of agency, purpose beyond simply the physical constituents of biology is potentially a Trojan horse for religious thinking and so on. And perhaps they've got good reason to, there have been many, long-standing debates between creationists and evolutionists and so on. But could you sketch out what the dangers are and how you can present this in a way that hopefully doesn't trigger those kinds of, warning signs or alerts on the behalf of scientists who perhaps are leery of religion somehow being imposed upon this sort of scientific quest?
Well, I think you have to ask yourself the question, do you love science more than you hate religion, or do you hate religion more than you love science? If hatred of religion is going to keep you from admitting that there's an elephant in the room because the religious people think the cosmos is purposeful, I think it's going to derail your scientific program badly. I don't think it's fair to make defending atheism your number one priority in what kind of science you practice. I think science needs to be neutral with respect to these metaphysical questions, at least to the point of being willing to consider them. If you come to not only biology, but cosmology or physics or anything else with the presumption maybe the cosmos is purposeful, maybe there's a plan of some kind, maybe there's an intrinsic order, I think it's actually more scientific to make those assumptions than not. All the great classical scientists like Boyle and Newton and Maxwell and Copernicus and Galileo came with that kind of presumption. And so it's a really simple question. Do you love science? Or are you just using science to keep certain people out of the conversation? Now, on the creation side, like my book, Evolution 2.0, if you were to summarize it in a couple of phrases, it's Darwinists underestimate nature and creationists underestimate God. And my investigations led me to believe that nature is intrinsically purposeful, not that a God had to show up every 500 million years or every 50 million years and introduce a whole bunch of new species or that the Earth was 6,000 years old. I didn't find that to make any sense at all. What I found was this intrinsic purposefulness of life was a very deep question. It's so deep, it's almost terrifying. And I think this is what has kept this nihilistic narrative at play. As soon as you open the door to that, you have so many unanswered questions. They're almost bewildering. Like, how deep does the purposefulness go? Does it go to the cellular level? Does it go to the components of the cell? Is a virus purposeful? I mean, these are not easy questions.
Denis, you say you don't come at this with a sort of religious perspective. You're just interested in the science, and yet the science itself seems to be pointing in certain metaphysical directions, which obviously makes some scientists uncomfortable. Not you. What do you kind of surmise from what appears to be in front of us now? This idea that there is almost a, for want of a better word, consciousness within life, within its ability to remold itself and to move in a certain direction towards not simply, adapting well to its environment, but to the fact we can have this conversation, the fact that we can have these incredibly deep thoughts. Do you sense that there's something, to use another phrase, transcendent about this overall pattern that we find in nature?
Yes, I think the best way I can start answering that very difficult question is, let's be clear from the beginning. Look at this box here. Inside this box is an organ that consumes at least 20% of the energy that I consume every day. I'm a physiologist. I naturally ask the question, why do we have what's inside here? This is what gives us our consciousness. We know that because if this is all damaged, we're unconscious. We don't seem any longer to be a living organism in the ordinary sense of the word at all. And, you can ask a simple evolutionary question. Why did evolution allow this to be developed? Is it there just, as Jerry Coyne would say, as a fantastic illusion that the evolution has left us with? The illusion that we have freedom, that we have agency, and so on. Well, I just reverse that and say, no, I need to explain why this evolved. Now, one reason is that it makes it easier for an organism to be creative in finding its way in the world. And the world is not an easy place to find your way in. Ask those cells from the lung that were finding themselves in a petri dish and trying to find a way. Organisms do this all the time. So my feeling is this. The metaphysical questions of what there is beyond what we can know directly through scientific investigation, those are extremely difficult. But I've no problem with those who wish to ask and try to answer such questions. That's fine. I can't answer those questions from what I do. As I said earlier on, I come to this straightforwardly as a scientist, but I understand the nature of the questions. Why is it that the water we need for life to exist at all is so strange in its chemical properties? You can go through a list like this, and indeed cosmologists have done that for us. There's a lovely book by Martin Rees, the great cosmologist here in the United Kingdom, just called Just 6 Numbers. He points out that if you adjusted these numbers even by a fairly modest amount in an attempt to explain how the universe has developed in the way that we think it has, you wouldn't get the universe that we now know, and you wouldn't get one capable of the evolution of life. Now, there's a very big question there. Why are those constants the way they are? I'm a computer modeler. That's how I developed my understanding of how the heartbeat gets generated. I was modeling the processes that I was measuring experimentally and showing that could account for it. If I'm presented with a model that depends on a high degree of accuracy in the constants in the model, I'm suspicious. And that's about as far as I can go. I say, okay, this raises some very deep questions, but I'm not capable of answering those questions.
I appreciate your honesty and humility in that sense, Denis.
The surprising rebirth of belief in God has been making waves since its launch. Now you can listen to all of Season 1. Discover the story of why new atheism grew old and secular thinkers are considering Christianity again. Featuring interviews with leading thinkers across the faith spectrum, you'll learn the inside account of the rise and fall of new atheism. All 30 episodes of Season 1 of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God are available now. Find out why we've become a #1 ranked religion and spirituality podcast when you jump in at episode 1. Go to justinbrierley.com/surprisingrebirth to subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. That's justinbrierley.com.
Moving from these sublime metaphysical questions to a very practical aspect of this, Perry, you've convened a cancer and evolution group. Tell us about that and where you see some of the practical applications of this new understanding of the agency of life, cells, and so on.
Well, 3.5 years ago, I worked with James Shapiro, Frank Lauke, Henry Heng, and Denis, and Azra Raza to form the Cancer and Evolution Working Group, which is now part of the American Association of Cancer Research. And the people who formed that group, for the most part, believed two things. They believed we've been running on the wrong definition of cancer for the last 50 years. Cancer is evolution of your own cells running out of control. It's not a genetic disease. It's not just a disease of uncontrolled proliferation. It's actually an evolutionary malfunction. And we are running on the wrong definition of evolution. The core organizers, for sure, those of us who formed the group, also believed that you can't define evolution as just a fitness and selection thing, but it's actually an intrinsically purposeful, intelligent process that will adapt to almost anything you throw at it, which is why stage 3 and 4 cancers are so hard to stop. And I found out later this had been attempted a few times, but this time the match lit the fire. And it is now a scientific organization with 3,500 members. We have physical conferences at least once a year. We have Zoom meetings every month. And there's some really extraordinary work that is being done there. We have people who are inducing and reversing cancer at will. We have people who are detecting cancer at stage -1. One of the prevailing beliefs among many members of the group is that cancer begins as a symbiotic merger between a tissue cell and a immune cell, very much along the lines of Len Margulis's mitochondria and chloroplasts. And so there's some very exciting work. I think there are many branches of medicine that cannot and will not be successful until you assume an intrinsically purposeful nature of body cells, tissues, and immune system. And then and only then are you going to make major progresses in cancer, age-related diseases, infectious diseases. This is a very big deal, and it's a huge paradigm shift in the way that you practice medicine.
It's a paradigm shift in general as well, Denis. I mean, it's been said that science progresses one funeral at a time. I hope that it doesn't take too many people to die for this new, way of thinking about biology to become mainstream. What do you see happening? I think you both acknowledge something major is changing in academic circles. The reality is, I think, on the ground, in terms of what's being taught in the average high school textbook or, the popular level narratives, everyone still assumes this is a blind, purposeless process. That's what we've been told. That's what everyone believes. So, Denis, do you think that kind of popular level understanding is also going to change in due course as we see a changing of the guard, really, in the academy?
Well, that's precisely what I experienced during my 2.5-week lecture tour. 9 lectures, many interviews, television appearances, and so on. It's precisely what I saw and witnessed happening in Korea. The opposition to the view that organisms are purposeful seems to have disappeared. That's the reality of the situation. I can imagine that might happen here, and particularly here in the UK at the moment. There is incidentally a difference, particularly in the arguments between evolutionary biologists and religious thinkers, a big difference between the United Kingdom and other parts of Europe and the United States. I think, if I can sum it up, the United States is still facing a direct clash between the two, as though you cannot at one and the same time be subscribing to the view that there is an evolutionary process of whatever kind, whether purposeful or not, and be at the same time a religious believer of one kind or another. But you see, over here in the UK, the great majority of religious believers I talk to are not questioning the process of evolution at all. It's as though the story is a dead one. It is, and now, of course, there are some extreme groups that would still maintain the old-fashioned view that you cannot be a particular kind of religious convinced person and at the same time accept there's an evolutionary process. But by and large, that's no longer debated as a serious issue. That means that it's quite possible that the United Kingdom quite soon will experience the same kind of transition that's already occurred in Korea, as the example from my experience in October. I'm very much hoping that that's going to be the case.
And just sticking with you for a moment there, Denis, I don't know how much interest you take in other areas, but my feeling is that it's interesting that this goes alongside other areas of philosophy and academia, where there are, again, it seems to be a pushback against a sort of very materialist, determinist, reductionist perspective, i.e.
absolutely.
The area of consciousness, which you've already alluded to, where I think, the Dennett deterministic sort of viewpoint is being pushed back. Now, not necessarily by some sort of theistic model, but certainly by people who are, seeing panpsychism, consciousness, those kinds of things as somehow, necessary and so on. So do you see this as potentially, about a paradigm shift in kind of the worldview, this idea, this worldview that has been so predominant that we live in this completely material, reductionist, deterministic universe, that people simply are, I guess, pushing back on that and saying, no, let's think about alternative explanations for reality?
I am certainly not alone. I'm reviewing a book at the moment that says exactly the same thing. I'll have a review very soon, published in one of the top science journals in the world, Nature. I think there's quite a lot of us now who are of the view that the idea that we can remove from the domain of scientific investigation one of the key properties of organisms, remember the box here, that is agency and purpose. There are many now who would go along with what I'm arguing. I get no pushback at all now in what I propose on this. On the contrary, we have only in the last year had several special issues of journals, special productions of books in parts of series that have been portraying exactly this kind of question. So all the way from 2016, when there was an attempt to actually get the Royal Society meeting cancelled. That actually happened. All the way from there to now, we've seen a shift in position. And I think it's not impossible that at some stage in the near future, this view that we have to regard organisms as purposive, and that's something for us to investigate as scientists, I can see that becoming the standard view. But there's a prediction. You'll find out in, say, 10 years' time whether I'm right.
Yes, indeed. Perhaps just as we start to close this up, Perry, why do you think there's been this more general shift, if you like? Obviously, at one level, it's just that at some point people have to accept the findings. You know, when they see what happens in a Petri dish and it just doesn't cohere with, you know, a particular sort of naturalistic, materialist, purely material sort of purposeless process, they have to revise their understanding. But as I say, it feels like it's part of a wider, you know, and that's my thesis, you know, in The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. I'm not saying everyone's becoming a believer in God, but it feels like at the very least that naturalistic perspective seems to being questioned more and more generally. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I've got a friend named Chris Fields. He's a quantum physicist, and he says all debates are eventually settled by technologies. And I think there's two ways in which that's true here. One is the technology of studying genes and the technology that is available to study biology. It gives us so much insight into what's actually happening that it's inevitable that the old view is crumbling. That's even true just from the standpoint of very basic genetics. But I think another reason why this change is happening is because humans are being confronted with increasingly powerful technology, and everybody can see that, you know, 20 years ago, and the World Wide Web was really taking off. There was a lot of people, we're going to be in a new era and a utopia, and people are going to have access to all the world's information. And it's more like everybody just kind of got drugged on screens. And I think this has pushed a lot of heart questions and soul questions and metaphysical questions to the front. Well, are we just living in a technological matrix? Like, is that all this is? Or is there more to humanity? And so, like, you look at the conversations, Justin, that you're having with Tom Holland or Jordan Peterson or a lot of these other thinkers, we're having conversations that we couldn't have imagined having 10 years ago. And I think it has a lot to do with the technology. Podcast is just a little part of it. But that's part of it too. The conversations are not inhibited by like some master curation of the Guardian or the New York Times. And so I think all of those things coming together at once, the pop culture is shifting, and the pop culture definitely affects the scientific culture. There's no question about it.
It's been absolutely fascinating to have you both with me to talk through some of these issues. So much more that we could have spoken about, but perhaps we'll get another opportunity in due course. But for now, Denis and Perry, thank you so much for being my guests.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, world-famous atheist biologist Richard Dawkins was mentioned a few times there, but did you know there are people who have actually been led out of atheism into belief in God, specifically because of Richard Dawkins? Well, Professor Alistair McGrath has been following this phenomenon closely and even wrote a book about it, which you can find out about in this video next. And you can visit justinbrierley.com for signed copies of my books, a free chapter with the newsletter, and to support my work through Patreon or US tax-deductible giving. Supporters can get free signed copies, early access, bonus content, and monthly catch-up calls with me. That's justinbrierley.com.